Well, hello everyone and welcome to our video lesson on the topic of transport systems. Now, I don't know about you, but my heart is just beating with excitement as we approach the end of this topic. Hooray! And if you're sitting there watching this video, then your heart is also probably working very hard, pumping and keeping you alive. So in the previous lesson, we looked at how the heart pumps blood into two circuits. Okay, the first circuit, called the pulmonary circuit, is where the heart pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs. And in the lungs, oxygen, I'm going to write O2, okay, moves into the blood. So now the blood becomes oxygenated and it is transported back to the heart. Now the second circuit, the systemic circuit, is where the heart pumps out that oxygenated blood to the body. Now in the body, all the different body parts need oxygen, so oxygen moves out of the blood and the blood becomes deoxygenated and is transported back to the heart. That's the second circuit. Now in this video, we're going to take a closer look at what happens in the lungs and in the body. Okay? So we're going to start by looking at what happens in the lungs, how oxygen moves into the blood, and then we'll take a look at what happens in the body, how oxygen moves out of the blood. You ready for it? Let's go. So we're going to zoom in first into the capillaries, the blood capillaries, those really tiny blood vessels in the lungs. Alright, we're going to see how the blood receives and picks up oxygen in the lungs. And then secondly, we're going to take a closer look into the capillaries in the other parts of the body, your arms and your legs. And we're going to look at how oxygen moves out of your blood into your tissue cells to provide them with oxygen. Importantly, both of these will be examples of diffusion in animals. Right? We've already seen examples of diffusion in plants. Right? When we saw how carbon dioxide and oxygen moves in and out of the leaf through the stomata. Now we're going to see examples of diffusion in animals. Take a deep breath. What you've just done is to fill up your lungs with air. Now when you breathe in, air moves into your body, right? It enters the windpipe and it moves into a series of air passages which branch repeatedly inside your lungs. Now at the end of these branches, there are these clusters of air sacs, right? Clusters of air sacs. They look a bit like grapes, right? But they're actually clusters of air sacs, and they have a name. We call them alveoli. And these alveoli, they are surrounded by capillaries, blood capillaries. Now take a look at this blue line here. What does it represent? Well, it represents a blood vessel that's carrying deoxygenated blood. And that deoxygenated blood is coming from the heart. And hopefully you still remember that it comes from the pulmonary artery. Right? So the heart pumps deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary artery and it goes to the lungs. The pulmonary artery, when it reaches the lungs, it branches out into smaller branches. And this here is one of the smaller branches that carries blood to the alveoli. Now you can see that once the deoxygenated blood in the capillaries come into contact with the alveoli, they receive oxygen, right? And then it becomes red. So from deoxygenated blood, they receive oxygen from the alveoli and it becomes oxygenated blood. And all these capillaries that carry oxygenated blood, they join back together and the blood is transported back to the heart. Right, of course, through the pulmonary vein. right? The blood is carried back to the heart. So let's take a closer look at one of these alveoli, right, in closer detail. So here is an air sac. This is the alveolus. Okay, alveolus is the singular, so one alveolus and many alveoli. So this is one of the air sacs. And here we see the blood capillary that surrounds the alveolus. Right, so the blood capillary carries deoxygenated blood from the heart, right? And then it receives oxygen from the alveolus, and then it becomes oxygenated blood, which is carried back to the heart. And these arrows here, they represent air that is moving in and out of the lungs, right? So air moves into the lungs and then into the alveolus, and then air moves out of the alveolus and out of the lungs. Now, gases are exchanged between the alveolus and the blood capillaries by diffusion. So here, deoxygenated blood coming from the heart, which is also very rich in carbon dioxide. So when the blood capillaries come into contact with the alveolus, carbon dioxide will diffuse from the bloodstream into the lungs. Now, why is that? Now, that's because there is a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in blood, right, compared to the lower concentration of carbon dioxide in the alveolus. So therefore, carbon dioxide moves from the bloodstream into the lungs by diffusion. Now, the deoxygenated blood also picks up oxygen. So oxygen diffuses from the lungs into the bloodstream. Right, so oxygen here, oxygen from outside of us goes into our lungs, then into the alveolus, and then it will diffuse into the bloodstream. Now, why? Again, it has to do with concentration. Now, in this case, let me change my colored pen. In this case, there is a higher concentration of oxygen in the alveolus and a lower concentration of oxygen in the bloodstream, right? Because this is deoxygenated blood from the heart. So oxygen will move from the alveolus into the bloodstream by diffusion, and the blood becomes oxygenated as it leaves the alveolus to go back to the heart. Okay, so we've seen how oxygen diffuses into the blood inside the lungs. Now let's take a look at how oxygen diffuses out of the blood when it reaches the other parts of the body. So here's a diagram of what happens when the blood that is rich in oxygen reaches other parts of the body. So here's the blood capillary, and you can see the red blood cells inside the blood capillary. And here are the tissue cells. So for example, these might be the cells of your leg muscles. Alright, so imagine you're running, and the cells of your leg muscles, they require oxygen. Alright, and then the blood in the blood capillaries is rich in oxygen because it comes from the heart. So these are the blood capillaries coming from the heart. So they're oxygenated and rich in oxygen. Now, how does oxygen move from the blood capillaries into the tissue cells, which really need oxygen? So capillaries are where substances move between the blood and the tissue cells. So firstly, useful substances such as oxygen and nutrients will move from the blood capillaries to tissue cells by diffusion. Right, so useful substances will move by diffusion because they are higher in concentration in the capillaries and compared to lower in concentration in the tissue cells. Because the tissue cells are constantly using up oxygen and using up nutrients, so there's a lower concentration inside the tissue cells of the useful substances. Now at the same time, your tissue cells are producing a lot of waste substances. For example, carbon dioxide, right? There's a very high concentration of waste products such as carbon dioxide in the tissue cells, right? Compared to the capillaries, where there is a lower concentration of carbon dioxide and waste products. So waste products such as carbon dioxide will move from the tissue cells to the blood capillaries by diffusion. So these are waste substances moving by diffusion. Now, one interesting observation is that the capillary walls, do you notice how thick they are? In this diagram, you see that the capillary walls are only 1 cell thick. And that's because this allows for faster diffusion of substances, faster exchange. So oxygen and nutrients can move faster from the blood capillaries to the tissue cells, and waste substances can move faster from the tissue cells into the capillaries. Right, if it's only 1 cell thick, imagine if this was really, really thick, it would take much longer. Alright, time for a quick check. Just pause the video for a while and work on these 2 questions. So hopefully you've tried the questions. Right, the concentration of oxygen is higher in the capillaries than in the body cells, right? Because the body cells are constantly using up oxygen. And the concentration of oxygen is lower in the capillaries than in the lungs, right? Because the lungs have a lot of oxygen, and oxygen moves from the lungs, more specifically from the alveolus, into the capillaries which surround the alveolus. Okay, so we've finished up with the notes, and we have seen some examples of diffusion in humans, right? We've seen and we've looked at diffusion taking place in the lungs and diffusion taking place in the tissue cells of the body. Now, before we end, I just want to explore this question with us. How does the circulatory system, the human circulatory system, work with other systems in our body? Let's have a big picture of that. So firstly, we've seen the respiratory system, right? It has the lungs and the windpipe and everything, and the transport system, which is the heart and blood vessels and blood. How do these 2 systems work together? What kind of work do they do together? How do they interact with one another? Now, hopefully you thought of the fact that, the respiratory system, that's where oxygen enters the body, right? And then there's some exchange of oxygen. Oxygen moves from the alveolus to the capillaries, and oxygen is transported to the heart. And then for the heart, it transports carbon dioxide and nutrients to the lungs, right? So carbon dioxide goes to the lungs to be removed from the body. Nutrients go to the lungs to provide the lungs with some nutrients as well. Now, how about the digestive system? How does the circulatory system work with the digestive system? What kind of substances does the transport system help to transport, which has to do with the digestive system? Well, as we shall see, right? Firstly, the digestive system needs oxygen, right? It needs oxygen to do all its digesting work. So the heart transports oxygen to the digestive system as well, so that they have oxygen to do work. And the digestive system produces a lot of carbon dioxide, which needs to go back to the heart, which needs to go back to the lungs to be removed. Now, the digestive system is also where nutrients are absorbed, and we'll see that in the next chapter. So the nutrients that will be absorbed will then be transported to the heart, and then from the heart to the lungs, and eventually it will be transported throughout the whole body. So the key point is that the circulatory system helps to transport substances between different body systems. So different body systems are all doing their own thing, producing this substance or that substance. It is the circulatory system, a bit like the MRT, that helps to transport substances between those different systems so they can work together. Alright, that's the end of our video. Please work on the notes, and when we come back to class, we'll look at the worksheet together.